Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is Granite State Home Educators' very first Zoom big meeting. We're thrilled to have Commissioner Frank Edelblut with us today. Thank you for joining us. Frank Edelblut is going to talk to us about something that's a really exciting thing happening here in the homeschool community. We're seeing a real strong interest in various home-based learning communities. It's sometimes called pods. It's sometimes called microschools. There's some variations to this, and it's really an exciting time to be a homeschooler in New Hampshire. So thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner.
Happy to be here.
So we have, I want to make sure people understand that we are recording this meeting. We are going to be sharing it on our website and various social media outreach tools that we have on Granite State Home Educators. So if people have questions, we're going to open it up to Q&A through our chat function there. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. Please save those to the last end of our hour. It'll be about 20 minutes at the end that we'll have for Q&A. And if you have any questions, we have part of our GSHE leadership team who will be checking through that and aggregating them so that the Commissioner and I can do our very best to address those for you. Let's see, I think that's it for the official business, and we can get started. So thank you very much again, sir, for joining us today. This is really great.
Michelle, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so I am happy to be here.
Well, you're a homeschooler yourself, so it's something very real for all of us, I think. So can you explain or give some kind of working definition of what a homeschool pod even is? Because that is it's kind of a new term. What does that even mean?
It is, and so I would actually separate two of those terms. You described it as a homeschool pod. Sometimes folks might refer to it as a micro school. And essentially what it is you have a small group of students. Generally, there is some type of a connection between them, and that may be some interest in learning. It may be a geographic, connection because they all live in the same neighborhood. And it functions a little bit like a one-room schoolhouse in that the students are engaged in their education, collaborating really with one another, and some study that they do on their own. So it could be that you have in a neighborhood, maybe you have 5 or 10 families or 5 families with 10 children. I don't know, it could be any configuration because it's a very flexible construct.
Yeah.
Where you have those students get together and they collaborate on their education. And again, it would be across different age groups. Perhaps you have some first graders, some second graders, third graders, fifth graders that are working together as they work towards the educational goals that they may have set for themselves. Is that pretty clear?
No, it makes sense to me. So these would be self-forming groups of their choice of who they include, what their purpose is, what they might be studying. Is that right?
They generally are self-selecting in terms of, coming together. And again, because it could be based on geography or interest or age or some other characteristic that draws the individuals together is generally what happens. And I think that you actually have pointed out a really important distinction. It's not kind of a zip code driven thing. Like, so in our traditional public education system, depending on what zip code you live in, that's who you cohort with for your education, and you go to the local public school. So this has a lot more flexibility in terms of how that cohort might get set up. Again, it could be based on neighbors, which would be some geographic, but it could be based on interest or some other characteristic that really just draws the families and those interested students together.
Nice. So what makes a homeschool pod different from a micro school? Are there distinctions, or are they really just the same thing?
I think I would call them the same thing. I mean, probably if you wanted to figure out how that might work is, and I'll describe it relative to New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire, we have 3 different types of approved learning institutions, right? We have our public schools, which include traditional public schools as well as public charter schools. We have private schools, and those private schools have 2 different approval processes. They can be approved for attendance, or they have a credentialed approval, like a certification in terms of the content that's taking place. And then we have home education programs. So all three of those are legitimate school options and educational options for students in New Hampshire. So you introduced it as kind of a home education pod. And so that would generally mean that the families who are participating in that are in that third group of their home education students who have found kind of that connection, and they form their group to work together on their school or their schooling or their learning, really, is what's taking place there. But it's also possible that a private school may have a pod or a micro school that is functioning, perhaps in and particularly in the COVID world that we're living in. This is what's made a lot of this very popular. So you may have students that attend a private school, or maybe they attend a traditional public school or a public charter school, and yet those students don't want to access their education in the traditional school facility for whatever reason. Maybe there's underlying health risks or something that they're dealing with. And so they could create a pod or a micro school, which would really just be a collection of students who are enrolled in that traditional public school learning system, but they're doing their education collectively together as a small pod or a micro school.
Okay, so it comes down to those three main types: public,
Correct.
private, or home schooling.
Yep.
And from there, there can be similarities, but it's that first point that makes the distinction. Is that correct?
Yeah, you don't have to conflate those, exactly. So the micro school is really talking more about the instructional model that's taking place, as opposed to when you say homeschooling, that's really kind of the authorization model that's taking place again. So authorization models include the traditional public school, the charter school, so that's the public, the private school, or the home education. All three legitimate authorization models in New Hampshire. Microschooling is kind of the instructional model in terms of how the instruction is taking place.
So for a family that is looking to do either a micro school or a homeschool pod, or just a group of friends studying together, does it have to be directed by the parents of the students involved? Can they hire somebody? Are there limits as to how they could organize that?
Yeah. So if it is, obviously, if it's taking place through the traditional, so through a public school or a private school, that the leadership of that approved public school or that approved private school would have responsibility and oversight responsibility for the education of those students. Obviously, in a home education, a parent fills out an intent to home educate. They file that either with the Department of Education. Many people send them directly to me by email or by mail, and then we send you back a letter. Or they can file that with their superintendent in their local district, or they can file that with a private school of record. Once they do that, in that declaration, they are then taking responsibility for the education of those students. And so those parents now have responsibility to, in the law, it talks about providing education. So what does that mean, really, to provide an education for a student? I sometimes like to think about it, you know, for my children, I provide food for them, but I don't grow all my own food. Sometimes I take them out to a restaurant, which they really appreciate, and somebody else is preparing that food. So provide is a very broad term in terms of its understanding and its application in terms of how the students are going to be able to access that education. And that doesn't just happen in the home education world. It happens also in my traditional public schools. Oftentimes a traditional public school contracts with a provider of services to a student to provide them. So it's really who has responsibility for making sure that happens. And so in a home education pod, as you describe it, it may be that the parents are collectively working together to provide that education or the instruction for that student. Perhaps the parents discover that one parent really likes the English language arts and another likes math. So they divide up those duties. It could be that neither one of them likes, science, and so they bring in a science person who really is good at science and can provide that type of curricular instruction to their students in their pod or in their micro school, as you've described it. So is that kind of clear, kind of how that works?
Could a family or collection of families form a pod and completely hire out that education component and still be homeschoolers?
Again, the provide is about responsibility for the education of their children, and that's what they are trying to do. So they could bring in tutors for all of the various subjects. And again, you see this even in the traditional environment. I mean, I have students that are enrolled in the traditional public school that take all of their coursework from VLAX. So they, in essence, have hired VLAX as the tutor to provide all of the instruction to that particular student. I have some students, particularly students who have individual education plans, who we may hire in the traditional environment. We may hire a third-party provider to provide all of the instruction for that particular student. And in fact, we quite often sometimes even have students placed in residential programs to provide all of that education. So again, it's who has responsibility. At the end of the day, who's going to be held accountable? So in my traditional public school, it is really the school leadership, and this happens for the privates as well. The school leadership is responsible. Have we provided a FAPE, a free and appropriate public education to those students, right? As a home education parent, in the statute, it says, here's what home education instruction consists of, and it's the responsibility of that parent to make sure that that is provided to the student, and it can be provided through a variety of different means.
Okay, so you referenced the statute, and so for our guests who are looking at that, that is RSA 193-A. It's pretty easy language, and I'm just going to read the main definition. It says, home education shall be provided by a parent for his own child unless the provider is as otherwise agreed upon by the appropriate parties named in paragraph 2. In paragraph 2 is where they mention the Department of Education, their local SAU, or a private school. So it references who their participating agency is, and that's who they sent their notification letter to. Yep. So do they need to get this pre-approved by their participating agency to be able to utilize any of these various options for their kids?
No, really, the only authorization you need is you need to file the intent to home educate, and then you have to go ahead and provide for that education. I often say to folks, because some folks, when they're thinking about home educating, are thinking, well, I filed an intent to home educate, so therefore I'm done. I'm like, no, that's actually the beginning of the journey, because filing your intent to home educate is much easier than actually providing that education. And so that happens. So the second part, or the second clause in that particular statute, would really be centered around if a parent or a guardian who has filed an intent to home educate is incapable of providing for some reason, and therefore would maybe have to reference one of these other service providers to help them in supporting that.
Okay, so there's no approval process for how they plug in for those providing options.
There's not. Right?
Okay.
And provide is a very broad term. Just like those same parents are providing food for their children, they have a lot of options for how they might provide the nourishment to their children.
Okay.
But I think that they're responsible for nourishing their kids.
No, that's great. No, that helps a lot. And there's been confusion and misunderstandings about what provide means and how to go about doing that. It's interesting because I think of originally homeschooling being very much centered around what took place in somebody's home. Maybe it was a group science class outside or a book club that met on a weekly basis in someone's home. And so this is almost like a throwback possibility to how homeschoolers used to operate. So it's not a new idea.
Right, definitely not a new idea. And I think part of why sometimes this legacy language, it becomes confusing sometimes. And I was asked this question on another podcast about a month or so ago that I was on. And really, I mean, ultimately, we would hope that parents are responsible for the education of their children. Home education being a very obvious assumption of that responsibility. But a lot of times the rules around home education, we have to remember, they came out of a system of compulsory attendance. And so some of those legacy thoughts and stuff maybe linger in the language. But in New Hampshire, again, it's quite clear. We have 3 different authorized educational pathways, public, private, and home education. And then we're going to hold those individuals responsible for the providing of that education. Okay,
great. So compulsory education kicks in once a child reaches age 6. of September 30th of the current school year. So if a child is not yet 6 years old and a family wants to have some sort of homeschool pod, microschool environment, is the child too young for that? How does that get handled for maybe a younger student?
I'm gonna try to answer this without giggling, but
Okay.
it's almost a silly construct because students are learning, children are learning from them before they're born,
Yeah.
right? Quite frankly, they're learning from the very beginning. Before a student even shows up or a child even shows up at school, in most cases, obviously not in all cases, but in most cases, they've already mastered an entire oral language,
Yeah.
right? So our job is to kind of nurture the inherent curiosity in children and let them learn. So I would hope that children are learning not because they've reached the age of 6 on September 30th, but that they are learning at 5 and at 4 and at 3 and at 2 and at 1, and really that we're creating environments where those children are able to really explore and exercise kind of that natural curiosity that children have for learning, quite frankly. I sometimes say children, some people think this is insensitive. It sounds too mechanistic, but I think of children as learning machines. I mean, they are just absorbing all the time. Anyone who's spent any time around children recognizes that. And really, that's sort of the essence around some of these micro schools or micro pods, is it creates in that smaller environment more flexibility to allow students to pursue their natural curiosities for learning and acquiring information around them. And the curiosity, particularly in that smaller cohort, is encouraged both because of the size of the group, could be based on where that particular micro school is located. It is the curiosity that is stemmed from their other students and children that are around them. And so it's just an environment that really encourages learning on the part of students.
So we have a lot of families that have younger students that are asking for guidance on this, whether their children are entering typical preschool levels of education or kindergarten. And because it's not compulsory yet for them, should they be registering as homeschoolers if they want to form these school units, or does it fall under daycare? It gets confusing for these children that are just a little bit younger. How does that work?
So assuming that it is a micro school, so it's an educational program that the students are participating in, it sounds to me more like a play group than anything else is what's happening. So for those students, so oftentimes families, particularly families who have some home educated students and some students who maybe are not home educated, and when those families are gathering together, it's really the students are playing together and engaging with one another and spending time with one another. The fact that you have younger children in that cohort of students who are maybe emulating some of the other students, that's just a benefit of those students participating in that process. There's no need, they don't have a compulsory requirement to be part of that process, but they certainly are able to participate, assuming, of course, that the activities and stuff are age appropriate for that child.
Okay, so if I'm understanding that, if a family has younger students under the age of compulsory ed, they're younger than 6, they can absolutely still form these self-organized homeschool groups and play, learn, do what they want without having to still file that letter of intent. Is that right?
Correct. Until the child reaches the compulsory age of education, they're not required to file an intent to home educate.
And they could call it a micro school or call it a preschool, whatever they want to call it. Is that right?
I mean, you could call it a play group, right?
Yeah.
Is generally, I mean, my own experience is that generally when you have, families getting together with young children, and it's not uncommon for that to happen, and they might even do this on a very regular basis. It's generally a play group or an opportunity to help socialize those children. So.
Sure, certainly. I know families are definitely looking for safe and appropriate ways to have that interaction, that social component, but in ways that they're comfortable. So, that's a dynamic many families are trying to figure out right now. Okay.
Well, I mean, particularly in the COVID world, I mean, one of the the attractive aspects of a micro school is because you have a very limited cohort of students, so you know who's showing up every time, and you're not necessarily exposed more broadly to someone who potentially is infected with coronavirus.
Okay, so can a family, I have a question that's come in, can a family file a letter of intent for a younger child to specifically have it fall under the education homeschool rules instead of daycare, particularly if they're maybe having several children, not of their own family, but several children with them in this playgroup?
Yeah, so I believe that if someone were to file an intent to home educate before their child reached compulsory education, we would send it back to them and just tell them that it would not be required of them.
Okay.
But
Okay.
there are specific daycare regulations. So for example, if someone is dropping students off, and I'm not an expert at the daycare regulations, just to be clear about this, but I mean, if you are hiring someone to care for your children who are, I think it's up to the age of 4, and you're just dropping them off at their house to care for them, and they're not of compulsory age at a certain number, you have now entered into a daycare relationship, not an educational relationship.
Okay, that helps clarify, because we've got a lot of families who are trying to figure out how to go back to work and still take care of their children during those work hours. So that helps a lot. Thank you for clarifying that. So in these micro school pod environments, does it matter if they are paying somebody to be that instructor for their children? Can they make it fee-based? Could the parent open that service essentially and say, I will supervise your children based on what you want for your homeschool child, but supervise them in my home for the day while you go to work?
So it is possible to compensate people if you bring in an outside instructor and they're going to be doing some of that instruction, it is possible to compensate them for that. They would be subject to the labor laws at that point in time, but it's not that question is not necessarily germane to your intent to home educate and your providing an education through some type of a education resource provider, like somebody who, to the example, if you've got somebody who's going to come in and they're going to teach a chemistry class for your kids and you pay them to do that, then that would be a legitimate thing for you to be able to do in terms of your provision of support for them. Not unlike when I go out to a restaurant and I have to pay for my food for my kids. I have provided food, but I had to pay someone for that.
Okay, that helps. That helps a lot too, because that's a common question. Obviously, people know there is a teacher certification process that is recognized by the public schools and private schools. Is there a certification for tutors? Is there anything like that that parents would need to be cognizant of, or do they use their own best judgment in who they would engage for that?
The parents would use their own best judgment. I would encourage them to exercise good judgment to know who they are exposing their children to. Because sadly, in this world, there are, unfortunate circumstances that happen. So I think that it is incumbent upon the individual who's accountable and responsible to make sure that they are doing the appropriate amount of due diligence to understand how they're and who they're engaging in the instruction of their children.
Oh, so it's up to the parent.
But that's for the parents. We don't have a tutoring credential or a tutoring process.
Okay, that helps too. Are there micro schools out there that do they need to be certified by the state to be able to extend their services in New Hampshire?
So again, we don't want to not conflate the instructional model from the approval process, right? So I have 3 approval processes. Public school, which goes through an approval process. Private school has an approval process. Home education has an approval process through the intent to home educate. And then the instructional model is something separate. So in New Hampshire, we do have, some micro schools that operate. One of my very favorites is Diane Murphy over on the coast at Big Fish.
Yep.
And Felix Alvarado at Straight A Academy in Bedford does a wonderful job in tutoring students across a variety of different subjects. So there are other entities in the state of New Hampshire who function that are supporting students in a variety of ways.
And that's considered homeschooling, even though they are at another facility, not in someone's private home.
That's correct.
Okay. So I know there have been a few others that operate, like Latitude Learning Resources in Manchester, and First Agape in Auburn has been around for a long time. So
yes, there are a number of, I know I'm familiar with First Agape, but there's a number of homeschool cooperatives, right?
Right.
And often the way that those cooperatives works is some families may take a whole breadth of courses through the cooperative. Others may only say like, well, I'm going to come here for art or for science or some other course that they are looking to supplement their instruction. Again, parent has responsibility to provide instruction, and they're using that as a resource to be able to provide for them.
So even in these co-ops or micro schools or homeschool pods, the parent is responsible for still following the legal requirements of home education. So
Right,
it's
the accountability in that it still falls to that parent who's filed an intent to home educate.
So they have to file that notification.
Yep.
And then they would have to still keep a portfolio, including that reading list, and then follow up at the end of the year with some sort of assessment. And there's a broad range of options there. But that is part of existing home school requirements, and the parent is still ultimately responsible for following those requirements.
For that work, exactly.
Got it. Okay. So that's consistent regardless of how they provide the education.
Right.
But that's still the requirements, baseline requirements.
That's correct.
Got it. Okay, that's super duper helpful. Let's see, with all these hybrids that are going on right now, where many public schools are outsourcing effectively the instruction to whether it's VLACs or potentially micro schools, that would then still be considered public school if they are ultimately still where the child is enrolled and providing these options. Is that right?
So it is. So I have had a number of conversations with superintendents across the state to try and find answers to the problems that they're trying to solve for their families. And in many of our districts right now, some of the opening plans that are being looked at include limiting the number of students that come into the school building so that the students can socially distance. Perhaps they don't have the ability in that building to socially distance. So they say like, look, we can only have half of our kids in the building at a time. And so they're setting up some schedules, for example, that may be, students whose names are A through L come on Monday and Tuesday, and students who are M through Z come on Wednesday and Thursday. And this has caused, so in many cases, what we've attained is we've been able to achieve the social distancing. But for some families, this type of an instructional model is not working well for them because they may need to go to school or may need to go to work, the parents, 5 days a week.
Right.
And so they're saying like, okay, so I know what I'm going to do on Monday and Tuesday, but what am I going to do the rest of the week? And so I have shared with superintendents the idea around a micro school, which could potentially provide for them an instructional model that is 5 days a week of instruction for those students. There is a micro school that operates quite extensively in Arizona. It's called PrendaSchools.com. PrendaSchools.com. I was mentioning that to somebody earlier today. Actually, it was somebody. I'll just leave it at that. And they said, oh, I can remember that, PradaSchools.com. And I was like, okay, if that helps you remember it, no problem. Apparently that was a really important thing. But, so districts, if they have, a cohort of families who the hybrid schedule of 2 days a week is not able to work for them, the public schools have the opportunity to offer, if they so choose, to their families, this micro school model. And it could be through a Prenda school, or the school district itself could set up a micro school. And in the New Hampshire statutes, in our laws, there is really a lot of flexibility for the districts and school board, local school boards, to be able to make these determinations for their families, whether those are as a result of maybe it's a manifestation education hardship for a family, right? So you've got a family and it's a hardship because they have to go to work, and the fact that they can't go to work because of their student, that maybe present a hardship for them. Maybe it's a hardship for the student because the student needs to be engaged in in-person instruction because of the learning style or the approach for that particular student or the socialization for that student. So the school districts have several different options for them. In our rules, in our 306 rules, I think it's 306.21, that talks about alternative programs for schools. So schools have the ability to offer alternative programming to their students already existing in our rules. Schools have the opportunity to offer distance learning opportunities to our families. So I would encourage families who, as the schools are pulling together their plans, and just to let you know, I know that our school leaders are working hard to try and come up with plans that are going to work. They have the opportunity to reach out to their school and share with them how those plans are going to affect them, and maybe even bring another alternative opportunity to the district and say, hey, these plans don't work, but maybe there's some other families in the district. Can we do one of these micro schools, and will you help us with that? And I think that they'd find superintendents and school leaders open to helping support them and meet the needs of their family, because I know that everyone is working through processes to figure out how do we set up a system that is able to support all of our families and our students in the state right now.
Right. And I know many school boards are still wrestling with those decisions now, with a reopening happening maybe just a month from now.
As we speak, yes. Our first school will open on Monday.
Oh, my.
And then most will be opening in early September.
Yeah. So could a family approach their school board or their superintendent and say, this reopening plan isn't working for me? And if they hear enough of that from their local families, maybe the school might be receptive to a micro school alternative or something. Is that?
Yeah, I think that, right, we're coming, and I hope that, I think it will happen, that our district leaders will appreciate that we're coming with solutions. The families are not just coming to say this doesn't work, but they're saying this doesn't work, but here's an alternative. Can you help me with this? And I would encourage them, if they want, they can ask the superintendent. If the superintendent is not familiar with this or how to do something like this, feel free to reach out to me directly. All of the superintendents have my cell phone number, and can feel free to call me in terms of, and then I can help them work through, what are some of the options that exist, whether it is kind of a Parental schools type model or some other type of approach that they might want to take.
And nothing's stopping a family from doing that right at the beginning of the year if their school is either not comfortable employing a model like that, or they just want to take that responsibility to themselves. They can do it.
So a particular parent, they may approach the school and say, I would like to do this. Can you help support me? And then hopefully the school will be able to support them. Hopefully they have enough students and families that would work for that. At any time, obviously, if a student or a family is not able to engage the educational programming that's offered by one of their three, right?
Yep.
They have the option to file an intent to homeschool, and then they can home educate, and then they can, if they have like-minded folks around them and they want to create their own micro school, that would be an option for them. This really is kind of the local schoolhouse. Very much this is the neighborhood school in many cases.
Definitely. So could a family potentially start off the school year with their local public school to try out whatever reopen plan they're offering, and let's say it just doesn't work for their child as they've tried it? Could they still choose to homeschool at some other point in the year, or do they have to decide now?
No, I mean, I do know that it's easier for the school districts to plan.
Sure.
If they know how many students are going to be showing up.
Yeah.
But we also know that we need to be flexible, because it may be that a student starts in the education program as it's been established and determines that it's not working, and they can certainly choose another pathway at any time that they want. And it could be that a parent chooses to home educate, and they may realize that it is a lot of work, right? I can say from personal experience, and they might say, wow, this is more difficult than I imagined. and they can then come back to their public school and say like, hey, I need to re-enroll my student here because I think that this was more difficult than I thought. It's not what I anticipated it would be. So
No,
we
fair
are
enough.
trying to remain as flexible as we can in terms of supporting our students and our families. With the, just keep in mind that, school districts are trying to plan. And so, try to make good decisions. This is, and I'm sure that everybody will because, nothing more important than our children. And so I know that everybody's trying to make good decisions in an uncertain time. And
Right.
so I think we all have to recognize when you're trying to make good decisions, but with the uncertainty of the times that we're in, that may mean that our decisions need to change as circumstances change as we go forward.
No, that's reasonable. Everybody's doing their very best right now. And a lot of unknowns and a lot of variables to try to manage somehow. Another question we have is, if a family chooses to work with an online tutor of any type or an online school, does it matter where that school is based? Could they be in Alaska or California or some other state? Do they have to be approved in New Hampshire?
They don't. Particularly, if you're in that third category, if you filed an intent to home educate, then the parent is responsible for providing for the education of their student. And I would assume that they're going to pull appropriate resources from anywhere in the world that is going to help them provide for the education of their students. I hate to keep going back to my food analogy, but when I go out to the restaurant, I don't check and say like, oh, I don't know if we're going to eat, Arkansas tomatoes tonight. I'm interested in the content of what it is that we're using to provide that instruction, and it's not limited by where its source is from.
Okay, fair enough. Great. So it's still the parents' responsibility, their best decisions, but ultimately their call, their responsibility.
Right. They are the accountable person relative to the education for that student.
Okay, super. I'm just checking through all my notes to make sure I'm trying to cover the questions that we've received ahead of time and what we've seen as being common threads in homeschool groups around the state. I think that is all that I have right now from the questions that have come in ahead of time. Let me just check in with my team to see if there's some other questions that seem to be of a concern. You mentioned Prenda. Are there other ones that a family could do in their own home that you know of? Not you mentioned Straight A, you mentioned Big Fish, these co-ops. Are there schools that can come to their own home or come to a shared central location and set up a little micro school like that? Is that possible?
So I think that that's a really legitimate question. I do not know the answer to that. I am familiar with Prenda schools.
Mm-hmm.
If there is another entity out there that is analogous to Prenda schools and does the same kind of thing, it could be that exists, and it's likely probably that it does, and I'm just not aware of that.
Sure.
So I apologize that I don't have more of those types of resources to bring to the table at this point in time.
Oh, that's okay. This is such a great time of innovation. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of them in the very near future. So I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if we hear about more of them becoming available in the coming months.
It's quite possible, right? And again, it's in response, I think, to trying to solve a problem that our education system is grappling with. How do we help support all of our families when we may not be able to bring all of our students into the building for in-person instruction, but we want to continue to support them.
Okay, that's fair. Can you so with these families who are struggling to make decisions and they so desperately want to get it right for their children, they're worried about getting it wrong. Do we send them back to school? Do we not? Do we try to homeschool? Do we not? It's such a big responsibility. What advice would you have for these parents that are grappling with these tough decisions right now?
So I think a great question. The first question that I would encourage them with is to remember that children are really resilient. That children are, again, they're curious, growing acquirers of knowledge. One of the things, it was interesting, after we moved through our spring period of remote instruction and support, there was a lot of conversation around the need to have for kids to have summer programming to make up the lost learning that may have been lost during our spring remote instruction period. And I have to tell you that, and again, I'm not speaking out of turn, because I know that they quoted this in another media piece that was out there. I said what kids really need to do is they need to get outside in the backyard and play. They need to go to the park. They need to go for a walk with a trusted adult. They need to relax a little bit. And so I was less worried about the learning loss, knowing that kids are resilient. They can catch up quite quickly. You know, I often say kids don't learn on this linear line. You may have actually, Michelle, heard me describe this before. Kids learn the same way that they grow physiologically. And if you want to understand how that works, you go to your home, you open the closet, and there's those little marks on the inside of the closet on the wall, like little Sharpie pen marks, and sometimes a date next to it. And this is where we mark the physical growth of our children. And sometimes those lines are really close together, and sometimes they're very far apart because the child has a growth spurt. And this is really the same way that the learning takes place. It's not a linear process. It's a step process. There's plateaus and growth spurts. And so I think what we really need to do is just continue to encourage an environment where students can be curious learners. And through that process of being a curious learner, they will explore things and learn things. And so I would just, for the parents who are anxious about this, and I'm speaking really specific to the education of their kids, not the broader pandemic. That's something for Dr. Chan, not myself. But relative to the education of the kids, to just be patient with themselves, be patient with their children. And if you make a decision, it's not the end of the world if it was the wrong decision. There's plenty of opportunity for catch up and moving forward. And as long as you just remain committed to allowing that student to find an environment where they can be successful as a curious learner.
Awesome. We are coming pretty much to the last 15 or so minutes of our time together tonight. So we're opening it up to questions from our guests. So if you have some specific questions you'd like the commissioner to answer, please type those into your chat box. Our team from Granite State Home Educators is collecting those and giving those to us to address to the commissioner here. So if you have some questions, please keep them out of the personal info, because we don't want you to share something that would be more sensitive. This is being recorded, and we're going to be sharing this in our social platforms, so please be mindful of that for your own privacy concerns. But we did get a question that says, if a family chooses to host other children in their home for remote learning through the district so that parents can go back to work or something like that, does that host family need to be certified or registered in any way if it's through the district where they're supervising the children?
Repeat the question one more time.
So it says, if a family chooses to host other children in their home for remote learning through the district, so it's not homeschooling, it's still through the district, but being supervised by maybe a neighbor or family friend, do they need to be certified or registered to be able, or carry insurance? Are there other things that they need to do to be able to take in those children if they're running that through the district for their remote learning program?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit more of a complex question than you've described there, but essentially what I would encourage, and I have been on record again encouraging this a lot, particularly if you've got those students who are either all remote or they're in kind of a hybrid circumstance where they're in school a couple of days and out of school a couple of days. I think it's great when students can get together with one another and study together.
Yep.
So there is no prohibition for students, you know, particularly, it's really a health question, right? As long as, you know, the pandemic is as it is today and there's not cohort limitation sizes, if a group of 5 or 6 or 7 students wants to get together and study together, I would absolutely encourage that. And if they have a home where they can get together with one another and study together and encourage one another and help one another through that remote learning process, I would absolutely encourage that as a good opportunity. And so even though in that circumstance, those students are not in what you might term a micro school or a pod school, they may actually attain some of those benefits for those couple of days when they're getting together and working as a study group and encouraging one another through that process.
So friends can still see each other. They
Yes,
can
and
still,
study together and help
yes,
one another and encourage one another. And I would encourage all of that.
wonderful. So families are still self-selecting to be in these maybe smaller cohorts of study groups and social groups, and they could still be public school students in somebody else's home and interacting and studying together and all of that.
Yeah, there's not a prohibition against students, cohorting with one another. You may want to, if those students on those remote days need to have internet access, they may find that one particular home has the best internet access in the neighborhood. And it's better for them to go and hang out with their friends and gain that internet access.
Good point.
And so some of the students may, in fact, want to do that. They should also consider, though, in that remote time, if the school has set up kind of a synchronous instructional module just for one of those students, just make sure that they have a place and environment where they can engage without distraction, that synchronous learning opportunity.
Sure. No, good point. Good point. We have another question about children who were in the process of going through the evaluation for special ed services. Let's see, but it came to a halt because of the remote learning this spring. If the family chooses to file a letter of intent to homeschool, can that testing still be completed through the district? How does that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I'm going to try to answer it, but I may not have the best answer. So I'm going to put a caveat around this and ask that whoever's asking that question reach out to my office, and I will make sure I get them a correct answer. But I believe that even home education students are allowed to attain an evaluation. So I think it would still be possible to follow through with that evaluation, and would encourage them to reach out to their district to be able to do that.
No, that's great. I know there's a referral process. We talk about it on our website about how to initiate it. So thank you for making your office available for families who have particular questions and very specific needs.
Okay.
Thank you. So another question we have is, when a child is home educated and they file that letter of intent, does the school district receive funding for that child? How does that work?
Yeah, so when a family elects that home education structural model, the school district would only receive education funding to the extent that the home education enrolled student enrolls in a traditional public school course. So a home education student who takes a traditional public school course, which they are allowed to participate in, they're allowed to take that course. The home district receives I think it's 0.157 of the adequacy for that student. So the public school is reimbursed by the state for the course that the home education student took at the public school.
And so it's proportionate to whatever extent the student engages with the public schools.
If they take 2 classes, they're going to get 0.157 times 2.
And if they take nothing at the public school, that funding does not go to the school.
Then the public school would not receive that funding.
Okay. All right. So that brings up a question I have about equal access. We're noticing some districts are now telling homeschool students that even if they are offering choir, band, or other extras, that's what they're often called, if the district is offering them, they are not intending to allow that for homeschool students or VLAX enrolled students. Can schools put restrictions on who has access?
Well, so public schools are required to offer to home education students the curricular and co-curricular activities that they offer to their general education students, on the same basis that they offer them to the kid in the child in the traditional public school. So typically where this comes up, for example, is maybe you have a home education student who wants to participate on a sports team, or as you described, in the band, right? So the school can't have a policy that is more restrictive for the home education student than it would be for the student who's enrolled in a traditional education program. So for example, if the school district said, in order to participate in the band, you have to have a C average or better, but they said, but if you're a home education student, you have to have a B average, right? So they're making it more restrictive to the home education student. That would be an inappropriate policy. And you could explain that to the district if they didn't understand that, or reach out to our office and we could help explain that to them.
Okay.
But that's basically, so those students are supposed to have pretty much equal access to that curricular and co-curricular model. Now, it is possible that, for example, the band is full, right? The band has a limitation and it only takes 35 students and they've got 35 students already signed up to it and you're coming in late to the party. Then it's possible, and again, on the same basis that a traditional student would say, like, that option is not available to you, a public school could tell a homeschool students that option is not available to you because it's full.
Certainly. So they could say you have the opportunity to try out for the sports team. You have the opportunity to try out for the school play, but they cannot say, no, you don't even get to audition.
Well, and they couldn't say that the reason why you're cut from the team is because you're a homeschool student or something. That would be inequitable. They could say if you're on the track team and you're not fast enough, perhaps they would tell you to try badminton or something. But,
fair enough. That's only reasonable. Got that. Okay. Another question we have is there some sort of list of core competencies or standards that a homeschool family might choose to reference especially if families are considering re-enrolling in public school at some point, because there are some families who are at least initially thinking this is a relatively short-term home education program. They, at this point at least, intend to re-enroll in their public or private school. Is there a list of requirements, whether it's standards or competencies or something that a family could use as a point of reference so they stay on track?
Yeah, so what I would encourage them to do, we have the Common Core standards. Those are publicly available on our website and a myriad of other websites as well. So those are really the standards which the students are supposed to be going through when they take an academic class in the traditional public school or even in the private school, as well as, in terms of home education, the standards as they are moving forward and learning. So I would encourage really a family that's thinking of, they're out and they're wanting to understand, they think they might be coming back in at some point in time, to coordinate really with their district. If you go to the district and say, like, look, I'm going to be homeschooling, but I don't, depending on how this COVID thing kind of moves forward, I may be coming back in. Can I get the algebra curriculum and I'll just use that in my home environment that I'm going to work with? And I'm quite certain that schools will be happy to make those available to the students. They're not required to, but I would suspect that they would be more than happy to help accommodate and support you in that effort.
Okay, so they can still research, find out what those are, and look to their local district for the information, even if it's not the resources and class participation. They could at least inquire and get info.
And I would also just encourage you, the schools are quite used to admitting students that come from an alternative system, whether those are homeschool students who are going into the school system, or we may have a student from Mississippi who his family moves from Mississippi to New Hampshire. They've got a different education system. They may have a different, scope and sequence that they're working with. And those schools are adept at understanding where that student is and where to plug that student in so that they can be successful. And so I think your district will be able to work with you in terms of reintegration.
Okay, super. I know that's a big concern for a lot of families who are using homeschooling as just an intermediate solution, potentially. Granite State Home Educators hope they stay homeschoolers and they'll just love the experience, but we recognize that that may not work for everybody. And so we want to still make this a positive experience where they meet their objectives for this time.
I mean, I don't imagine that reintegration will be difficult.
Okay, super. So if it's another couple questions, if a child is homeschooled through VLACs or these other programs that issue exams and final grades and is accredited, is the family still responsible as homeschoolers for a portfolio or review or standardized tests? Do they still have to do that?
They do, yes.
Now, could they use the third option of that mutually agreed upon alternative with their participating agency? Could they say
evaluation, right?
Yeah.
They're able to do the evaluation as an alternative, right? But that exists no matter if you're doing it on your own or you're doing it with someone else.
Right.
That is an opportunity for you as well.
So a family could work with their initial school entity, DOE, private school, or their local SAU, whoever they sent their notification letter to, work with them to say, will this be sufficient to satisfy our year-end assessment?
Yes, but they don't have to work only with the agency that they filed with. They just have to, I believe, and I don't have that law in front of me, but I believe they only have to work with a certified educator in terms of that portfolio evaluation.
That's true. They absolutely can. They can choose who that teacher is.
It's not tied to where you filed the intent to home educate. It's just the evaluation by a certified educator as an option if you didn't want to do the assessment, for example.
Right. And then there's that third alternative that says mutually agreed upon.
Call me. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. There might be some other thing. I mean, you have to understand, like, as those laws have been drawn up, I mean, maybe you have a family that has been living in, Mongolia someplace, right? And home educating and teaching out there. And, they come in and they don't have anything familiar, right? And so you have to have an option to allow those students to reintegrate and engage as well. And so I think that those are the types of things that were anticipated when that law was developed.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Super. I think we've got one final question here. It says, gets back to the equal access question that we discussed. It asks, has there been a change to the law in light of COVID about homeschoolers participating in public school co-curriculars or curricular activities? Is there a caveat or exemption for that during this COVID time?
There has not been a caveat or an extension, but bearing in mind that you're only able to participate in that curricular, co-curricular activity to the extent that the school is offering it, right?
True.
I mean, in other words, if the school is only offering 2 days a week of instruction, of in-person instruction, that's what you would be afforded. You wouldn't be afforded 5 days a week because that's what you wanted. So yes, you can only engage the system as is presented.
So if they are not offering a fall sport that your child wants, you don't get to participate because it's not available.
It doesn't even exist, right? No one's able to participate. So there's, equitable access to nothing.
Fair enough, then. It's at least fair. All right. I think that handles all the questions that we've received. Certainly, if any of our guests have more questions, please reach out to us at Granite State Home Educators. Our email is info@granitestatehomeeducators.org. You can certainly find us on Facebook. Reach out to us. We want to thank Commissioner Edelblut for spending this evening with us. It's been great and very, very informative. I believe we've done a thorough job in addressing a lot of the big questions that families have been grappling with. So thank you so much for spending your time with us. So for families, we are still going to be recording this. It'll be available on our website, our social media. So you'll be able to tune back in and re-listen to the commissioner explaining these sensitive topics. You can hear it again right from him. We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We do have a special announcement. Granite State Home Educators is launching today a special group for these families that are searching to find each other for these homeschool pods and learning communities. It is called GSHE Homeschool Pods Connection. You'll find it on Facebook. Its purpose is to connect families who have a common element to help them find each other and connect and find these education providers so that they can just connect and make this school year work for them and their families. So find us at GSHE Homeschool Pods Connection. We'll have links to that on our main Facebook page and everything else so people can find us and plug in. So thank you again, Commissioner. We really appreciate your time tonight. You've been awesome.
just would encourage anyone who has questions. You know, I know sometimes for folks it can be a little bit intimidating maybe to think that they're reaching out to the Department of Education, but we are there to support you and help you be successful. So encourage you, whatever question you have, to please reach out to us so that we can support you and your children and your family. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for tuning in tonight. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. And now I'm going to stop the recording, and we appreciate everybody being here.